So, many thanks for two inspiring talks. They remind us that decisions begin with individuals who can organize locally. States often have a lot of decision power, but to be effective, the states need to keep together local coalitions. And only when a sufficiently strong domestic coalition is in place can the nations effectively negotiate internationally. So if we want this global green transition to be supported democratically, we must hold together all these coalitions. And global cooperations seem very tough to achieve in a time when many people in the rich world are preoccupied by other problems, not least that some voter groups are poorer and less secure than they were 2 decades ago. So let me start with that problem. To what extent would you say that the political headwinds in the rich countries are caused by the economic shocks to vulnerable domestic groups?
Yeah.
I mean, we're all free from rich countries.
Yeah, exactly.
And you showed us some data on the concerns of domestic groups, partly in the rich countries. Right. So what would you say? Why are green issues so low on the agenda, and to what extent? You mentioned Ukraine, the war, but there have been other events like the Great Recession, China shock, and so on.
I mean, for sure, it's easier to get your citizens to think about these issues in a world of increasing prosperity. And if you think of many of the things, so I described, in a sense, a golden age of effective government in the post-Second World War period. Why was that a golden age? Economies were growing. Public resources were therefore plentiful. You didn't have to put up taxes. You just had taxes came to you naturally. You were able then to disperse them into things that citizens valued. So without a doubt, it's easier to resolve any kinds of issues in a world where the pie is expanding. Now, what makes this issue then difficult is there's a whole wing of people who say, we need to put an end to economic growth. Well, at the moment, growth is much lower than we had before. But equally, that's creating part of the challenge of reacting to it. In some work I've been doing, I didn't have time to cover it. I had a slide on it, but it doesn't really matter. I can't show it. There's a very, very strong link between being in a growing country and trust in government. Yes. And I think part of the deficit of getting collective action on this issue is people don't trust their governments to be doing the right thing. So the government comes along with an idea and they think, well, why should I go along with that? And then there's a shrinking pie. I mean, the issues that Dean was talking about, that in an era of retrenchment, it may be true that there are still plenty of good things to do, and I genuinely believe that. But the position you're in, the trade-offs you face between the things you can support become much more intense. And so this leaves a dilemma. Do we agree that the priority for the countries that we're relying on to solve this is to promote economic growth? Some would say, no, we need degrowth. I don't happen to agree with that, and that's a bigger conversation that we could have. But I think you're putting your finger on what I think is one of the central tensions and issues that we face, and many of the difficulties do arise from being in a much more difficult economic situation than in the past.
Right, but because it strikes me that aid and green transition, they are very similar in many ways. So the green transition, even if you think only about the rich countries, that's about us versus future generations. The aid is us, relative to people in poorer countries, and of course the people in the poorer countries are also the ones that will benefit the most from reducing the speed of the climate change.
Yeah, no, look, it's I think you're spot on, and both are abstract benefits, right? And that's part of the challenge. If you're dealing with, I think we had at least in the US, it seems like you have a collision of a few things happening at the same time. You do have, anytime, you always have some structural change happening, right, in general. Like that's just, period. And so you combine the fact with benefits are abstract to, it's very hard, someone has a famous line I'm about to crib, I don't know who it is, but it's very hard to convince someone of something that is against their self-interest. Right, in a very, and I mean that in a very immediate and visceral way, right? It might be in their self-interest in the long run, but not in some sort of global sense. But it's not, who has this line? Someone has this line, It's said much better than I just said it. But regardless, the point is, if you're taking a coal worker who's out of a job because of coal, it's very hard to, it's very easy for them to accept that the push against coal was a bad idea because it cost them a job. And then you combine that with, call it good marketing, call it manipulation, but just a recognition of the vulnerabilities and how to create scapegoats in the economy that then are used to rally votes and rally support, because you do have in many cases, effectively voting taking place for policies which are actually counter to what they might actually want in the long run in terms of their preferences. So you have a collision of all these things happening at the same time is part of what I see as having happened.
Right. So it's difficult to build these political coalitions harder now in the rich countries than maybe it was before. But on the other hand, and we've talked about this at the previous Misum Forums, despite these political headwinds, it seems to me that the private sector is, in fact, greening fast with solar panels, windmills, better batteries, and electrification of cars. So all is not bad. Does that mean that even if the climate problem is global, perhaps we are less reliant on international political organization than many economists and political scientists have thought?
I mean, there is. I'm actually more keen to hear what others think on this, but my rough sense is that you do have a lot of innovation that's taking place that the private sector is investing in, but that fundamentally there's a public goods problem here. I mean, fundamentally you're talking about externalities, and those are benefits that don't get paid in. So unless you have a way of actually internalizing the externality, just economics 101 tells us that the profits are not going to be there to be had unless you do something at the global level to recalibrate the benefits that accrue. Otherwise, there aren't the returns to the private sector. Right? So you have to do something to change to organize the system so that those benefits go to, the revenue gets collected to pay off and make the innovation worthwhile.
Okay, so let me provoke a bit more on that. I mean, it seems to me that there are actors that are actually subsidizing very heavily. We call them China. And we should be applauding, right? Because they're doing what would be globally good. That's not what we're doing. Why not?
Why is that I think that makes sense. Why is that yeah.
I mean, so it's not the problem that they subsidize, but it seems to me it is a problem that EU won't let in their goods. I mean, we put anti-dumping tariffs on Chinese goods after the Chinese have done what we've asked them to do.
But I think there's a couple of issues here. One is I don't think we're doing a great job at selling the benefits to our citizens. I mean, maybe I'm in an unusual place given the country I come from, but where it turns out that there's been a huge expansion in the sales of Chinese electric vehicles, no move towards protectionism. And one of the things we're seeing was actually last month, there was a record uptake of electric vehicles. And why? These are really good vehicles. And people, so I think we need to be selling the benefits of positive greener lifestyles. It's always been sold, well, I say it's always been sold, many people have sold it as a kind of what we call a hair shirt mentality. Oh, it's good, it's better for you, but you know, you're going to suffer from this. Actually, many of the things that we're asking people to do will, even in the short term, be very attractive things for them. And then there's the externality benefit. There's cleaner air. So I think we just need to change the narrative a bit towards emphasizing the benefits. And government policy is then going to be much easier to push in that direction when we have a more positive narrative around this.
Right. So this would be one example where Brexit were helping the consumers, I guess. But
maybe the only one. I don't know. No, I didn't say that.
But EU, which I think it's fair to say, EU has been quite progressive when it comes to green transition policies.
Right.
But in this case, it's not. I mean, we could have retaliated the. So I mean, first of all, anti-dumping is a bit. It's a bit strange to to think about anti-dumping for green subsidies to start with. But if you wanted to retaliate, you could retaliate with subsidies of your own.
Exactly.
And that didn't happen. So, I mean, you're the political economist. Why didn't it happen?
Well, I might be a political economist, but I don't profess to be an expert on the politics of the European Union. But it is interesting, just indicative of what I showed you, the evidence in that paper, that the political institutions of the European Union, as manifested in the European Parliament, seem not to be particularly well aligned to this. Now there's a large representation of groups that are avowedly hostile towards some of these changes.
Indeed.
No, I was going to ask your question to you. Because when you posed the anti-dumping, that was my reaction: is fight it with a direct subsidy. So why doesn't the EU respond that way?
I've thought a little bit about that. My guess is, so for Britain, they have much less of a car industry now than Germany does. So there is more, Germans are more scared of the Chinese imports than the Brits. But of course, we could have helped Germany out. I mean, it's all about compensating the losers, right? And we have EU. So EU could have been compensating the losers in Germany.
Can I pick you up on that? It's a very classic economist response to say it's all a problem of compensating the losers. I'm not convinced about that. It's much more than a job is much more than just a paycheck and a number of hours you have to show up. People are proud of the kind of occupation they're in. And I think we've made the mistake, in particularly when globalization came along, in believing, oh, we can have, quotes, the more efficient production. Oh, we can compensate losers. Let me give you a concrete example, because my grandfather worked in the mines of South Yorkshire, and all the mines got closed. Well, you'd say coal was cheaper if we brought it from Poland, true. And eventually we would have wanted rid of the mines anyway because we disapprove of coal as a source of power. But it destroyed communities. Those communities have, to this day, never recovered from the fact that people were dislocated from traditional communities. They were very proud of those communities. And so I think we need to be a little careful. I'm being slightly stating this perhaps more strongly than I need to, of just saying, oh, politics compensates the losers and it'll all go away. I don't think it goes away that easily, because I think the kinds of lifestyles that people have, they become very attached. There's a sense of identity. They get attached to the way things are, and we can't just dislocate it and expect people to.
Yeah. So I in fact agree with that. So which is why my proposed political solution would not be just to make transfers to those areas in Germany where they previously made cars, but to allow them to transition from fossil fuel cars to building electric vehicles. So then you could still have the car workers. So
yes, but that's not compensating the losers in the way it's traditionally understood. It's just that you accept the Chinese now can build cars more cheaply, so we need to redeploy workers to something else rather than building cars. Because at the end of the day, the amount of capacity you have in the car industry will be set by the number of cars that people need to drive, and you want to have them, as an economist, produced in the most efficient location. But anyway,
okay. So you think the transition from fossil fuel to green production in Germany isn't going to be the solution because China's production capacity is just so great that they are the ones to be doing this?
I suspect in the end the capacity of the German car industry will not be what it is today if market forces were allowed to just play out. Yeah, it will have to shrink somewhat because there's an increasing global capacity. But anyway, I don't.
Right, but to press you then, your favorite policy on imports from China is?
Well, like you say, it's very economy dependent. If I was saying what's the policy for Germany, I think it would be very different from what the policy is for Britain. And like you made the point yourself, Britain does not have a large car industry, so we can afford to be relaxed about imports of electric vehicles. We don't have a large solar panel industry, so we can be relaxed about imports of solar panels. But if I was sitting in a country without those conditions, I would have to think seriously before doing that. And I don't think I would take the view, I just want to compensate losers. I mean, but I'm not, anyway.
So you're worried about the hooligan industry? Not
So getting back to this question of international cooperation then. So of course, Donald Trump has been withdrawing particularly aggressively from international organizations. But as was pointed out at the conference that we had here yesterday on international trade, already Barack Obama was obstructing the functioning of the World Trade Organization. And with respect to multilateral trade, Biden didn't represent much of a break with Trump 1 policies. The United States obstruction of WTO seems relevant to the green transition. Only a month ago, September 15, the international agreement on fishery subsidies, that was ratified by 2/3 of WTO membership, including the United States, by the way. And that agreement allows individual countries to put punitive tariffs on countries that subsidize overfishing, illustrating how trade policy can be used to promote green goals. And this was the first time, actually, WTO was used for such an environmental purpose. Given the Trump tariffs and the withdrawal of military engagement and dismantling of non-military engagement like yours, it seems reasonable to ask, will this also be the last multilateral green policy that has US support?
That's not the way I expected you to end the question. I'm hesitant to pontificate on, future politics. What I would say is, there's one thing in particular that I think is the nature of democracy that has got us a little bit into the problem we have on tariffs. And it's democracy intersected with these kind of rounding to zero problem. So when you think about, why did Biden keep in place some of the tariffs that Trump 1 put in place, right? Look, I wasn't in the room to make those decisions, so I'm just saying what I heard, which is, a tariff has a very tangible, salient benefit to the one industry, the one sector that it's, so if it's steel, like you're a steel manufacturer, you're a steel worker, you're very aware of that tariff being something that is, in a sense, protecting your job. But if you're a consumer and you're buying a car that is now, $25 more expensive because of this, you don't feel that, right? And so there's just a very basic voting constituent who has the voice problem, and the benefits that accrue from not having tariffs are basically rounded to zero in most people's minds, except the very people working in the very industry for the very goods that have the tariffs, and then they're keenly in favor. And so that creates a disconnect when you then aggregate that up, because everything else rounds to zero, and only those people end up with a voice, right? And so that was, in not so many words, how, why I think some of the tariffs stayed in place instead of removing them, because it was deemed kind of difficult to take that away.
Yeah,
and likewise, you see this kind of ratcheting, this difficult conversation with tariffs that take place.
right. And I mean,
It doesn't address your green question, but like
no, but I mean, there were other things that U.S. did also. I mean, refusing to appoint judges for the appellate panel and so on. So it was clear that they didn't want to be constrained by the WTO. And more generally don't seem to be wanting to be constrained by other multinational organizations. And presumably because it's so hard to build to build an internal coalition in the United States for any of those big international objectives, like free trade or the green transition, for that matter.
Right.
So do you foresee? So another way. I mean, I could get at it through Tim's angle. Is it possible to build such a coalition again? Because we have had it in the past.
I don't think you can exaggerate the extent to which the US has, from most of its history, been somewhat half-hearted in its commitment to many institutions. I mean, a recent example, which is under Obama, was the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was a major innovation, and the US refused to participate. Every other country in the world decided to participate in the governance of that institution. And that had nothing to do with Trump. That was a decision made on the basis of what was perceived US national interest. The US is exceptional for a few reasons. Of course, it's a relatively closed economy compared to, say, most of the economies of Europe. So there's a different perspective, and I think there always has been, on global cooperation. I think the unique period, when we look back and we eventually write the history of the 20th and 21st century, is going to be the post-Second World War period, where, because of the Cold War, the US submitted to the idea of preserving a particular model of how we thought economies and polities should work, and that was supported through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and that kind of held. And the US was a full-on partner in that enterprise. But it's not so surprising that once that raison d'etre sort of came to an end, things changed in terms of the US perception of its role in the world.
Right. So that sounds like a very depressing message, though. Do we need another world war in order to come together again?
Well, certainly, no. The answer to that. I mean, I think there is a big call that none of us in the room know the answer to, but we could spend endless time talking to each other about, is what we think the next move is in the US. Will there be a renormalization, which would bring the US back in to some extent into the sphere of global cooperation? I speak to experts on American politics the whole time, and they disagree about what happens next, simply because it's very, very hard to fathom the path that the US is on, from sometimes in a deeply depressing path, which sees it as a permanent erosion of the institutions of government, through to this is a temporary phenomenon, and 4 or 5 years' time we'll wonder what all the fuss was about. I mean, I'm not quite, but I'm being glib, but that this will look like it's a resumption of normality. And Dean should be able to answer as an American citizen, but I bet
he shouldn't he?
No, but I'm sure, like all the other experts on this, you'll know just how uncertain it is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I continue to be surprised. I would say that when we look back at the post-Watergate period, you saw a striking number of government reforms that took place to try to prevent a Watergate from happening. Today Watergate actually seems like, wait, you resigned over what? Like it seems, minor, but regardless, the point is, even, you did see bipartisan efforts at government reform in response to Watergate, but you also saw more bipartisan, Nixon resigned because Republicans said, we're not content with what you've done, and that doesn't happen these days with with levels of actions that are well, just that. You don't see that happening within. Maybe something will happen to split the Republican Party, but it's striking to me that the biggest thing that's caused the biggest split so far is Epstein, which is in some sense the most irrelevant from public policy that you can get, and yet that's where you see Republicans deviating from Trump. So that's striking, and I don't know what it would take. A lot of people thought after January 6th that was the split, that was going to cause the split, and yet it didn't. So I don't pretend to be able to predict, but I just hope that whenever we get to some point, that there is going to be a moment where similar to the 1973, where you did see some bipartisan effort to say, what changes do we need to make to our political process and our accountability in government reform to not have that happen again. And maybe that will happen this time too, where someone, when they're not the ones immediately benefiting from the issue, will realize that, okay, wait a second, this gerrymandering has got to stop. This could swing wildly against me someday, and I don't want that. So how do we come together and form a system that addresses that better? So I don't know what it'll take to get there, and maybe we won't. That part I'm not predicting. I'm just saying that we do see these swings happen, and hopefully we'll see a moment in which reasonable people can come together and talk about process reform.
Right.
Because clearly we've had an erosion of institutions that need that level of thinking about the rules of engagement and what's a norm and what's a rule.
Yeah, so that will be our kind of real-life Hollywood movie that we'll all be following very closely. And yesterday's conference on international trade ended with, we'll have to follow that closely, but in the meantime, we need to think about what international trade system can we support without the US. And I guess the same conclusion here is, we'll have to figure out what kind of green transition policies we can pursue without the US. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.